So I have been going through One Piece and I'm making my way further and further post time skip. But even as I get deeper into the series, I find myself routinely thinking back to Marineford. But even so, with an arc like Marineford, there is just so much to talk about. Even on this channel, I've made videos discussing different aspects of it. I've talked about standout characters or standout moments from the arc, and maybe one of these days I'll create a full arc review of Marineford. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you want to see that one day. But regardless, the purpose of this video is I find myself routinely thinking back to the main villain of Marineford. Now, even so, I understand that there are many candidates for who people may consider the primary villain of Marineford. Perhaps you would want to pick somebody like Fleet Admiral Sengoku, since he obviously oversaw and commanded the whole marine side of the war. Or maybe you want to say it's somebody like Blackbeard, who obviously did a bunch of horrible stuff. But honestly, I don't believe anyone except one person truly earned the claim of being the main villain of Marineford, as much as the character of Admiral Akainu, also known as Sakazuki. Now, I understand when talking about a character like Akainu, people have some very strong opinions on this character, and I want to be clear, I'm not making this video to talk about whether or not I like Akainu, but rather I'm making this video to talk about his unique role even among One Piece villains for me, since I genuinely believe Akainu is one of the more terrifying villains in One Piece, and he may even be the most haunting villain to me, at least the villains I've seen, which I know can definitely be a bold claim. Now, to be clear, I'm only around the start of Dressrosa, so in this video I'm not going to reference anything past that point, because in this video I'm going to try my best to explain why Akainu is such a terrifying villain to me, because again, he definitely terrifies me. But the thing is, before I can even look at his role at Marineford, I need to first look at his introduction into the story, because One Piece from the very start, from his very first appearance, although it's brief, it perfectly encapsulates him as a character, his ideology, what makes him so scary. And the thing is, when I first saw this moment, I was like, okay, that's kind of crazy. But now that I have the context of Marineford, when I look back at this moment, I'm like, actually, this was a perfect build-up moment for him as a character. Because when I look at everything that happened at Marineford, none of it is shocking when you look at his introduction. And even with his introduction, it was like One Piece was basically like, okay, how can we introduce just how devastating of a character this is going to be? And they were like, okay, I've got an idea. We can introduce him normally, or how about this? We can introduce him in one of the darkest moments in One Piece, and not only that, but we are going to have him do one of the darkest things in that particular moment. If you forgot what this dude did, it is haunting. Like, what he did in his introduction is actually arguably worse than anything I've seen him do. Because again, he's introduced in Robin's flashback in the destruction of Ohara. But even so, I love the way One Piece builds to when you first see him, and even the way they use other characters to show just how different this guy Akainu will be. Because first you see a despicable character like Spandine, and again, this dude sucks, and he does plenty of horrible stuff. He orders the destruction of Ohara with a buster call. But I do think there's an important thing about what he does, because Spandine, as bad as he is, he's even like, okay, the civilians who aren't scholars, yeah, they can leave safely. Because even he's like, okay, I might be bad, I'm not that bad. Like, yeah, we're not gonna kill a bunch of innocent civilians for no reason who aren't tied to the stuff we're investigating. And I think that's an important detail when discussing Akainu in a moment, because again, if you've seen the moment, like, you know where this is going. But in addition to that, I also think it's fundamentally important that Aokiji was actually here at the destruction of Ohara. Now, he wasn't Admiral Aokiji at this point, he was just Vice Admiral Kuzan, just like Admiral Akainu was technically just Vice Admiral Sakazuki at this point. And so I think it's fundamentally important the way they use Aokiji as a character to build up Akainu as a character. Because keep in mind, at this point in the story, we had only met one of the admirals. That, of course, is Aokiji, so up to this point, we only have one frame of reference for what an admiral is like. Now, we're about to be introduced to another one, and One Piece is like, okay, you know what Aokiji is like as a character? We're gonna show you something that's about to horrify him, and Aokiji is definitely interesting. He's also scary in his own right, but that's more so because he's supremely powerful. But as far as like his personality and things like that, he seems mostly likable. Aokiji is about to seem quite friendly compared to what they're about to show. Because even Aokiji in this moment, we get to see his sense of justice, which in my opinion is more of a sensible form of justice. It's called lazy justice. And what that basically means is he doesn't just blindly follow orders. No, he looks at the situation and he's like, okay, how do I act based on what's currently happening? So if that means disregarding orders, then he does that. So One Piece is about to show you his form of justice on display, which I think is more sensible. We even saw that when he came across the crew, a bunch of pirates, he actually spared them. But it's interesting that even in this moment, Aokiji seems more than willing to follow orders, at least currently, because on Ohara, he's trying to stop Saul and Robin from escaping. And when Saul is confronting him like, you have to see that this is evil, Aokiji tells him, if this is for the greater good of the world, I have no opinion. The scholars are breaking the law after all, because Aokiji in this moment, he doesn't really know what to think. Now, I'm not entirely certain how much he would have followed through if what happened did not happen, which only makes what's about to happen now more impactful, because then you get one of the most haunting moments in all of One Piece. When in the background you see the civilian ship, it just explodes. And in that moment, justifiably so, you see the horror on Aokiji's face. Like, this was a man who just realized in that moment, like, oh, okay, I might be messing up here. Okay, if it wasn't clear, in this moment, we're definitely the bad guys. And something I like about this moment is you see Spandine's reaction. Like, this is not a good guy. He's the one who called in the Buster call. And even he is horrified, like, I didn't order this. Now, I should mention that as far as I could see, his reaction was not actually in the manga, but I actually still think it's very much in character, and I like the addition in the anime. Because the thing is, from every indication, he did not want those civilians dead. And honestly, I'll never forget the moment when they first pan out to Akainu, who at this point is just Vice Admiral Sakazuki, because again, unprompted, he's the one who gave the order for the killing of those civilians. So he can't claim that he was following orders or this or that. Like, no, that was his idea. And to me, it's kind of scary the fact that this guy has basically no reaction. Like, he doesn't seem at all torn up about what he did, or like he would lose any sleep over it. Which only makes it even scarier to me, because in his mind he did the most obvious thing, as if it was perfectly reasonable to just destroy a civilian ship. And a big part of the reason I'm bringing this up before even getting into Marineford, and I know I'm spending a while with this, but again, this moment is so important, is because Akainu gives a quote that perfectly explains his ideology as a character, and I'm trying to convey why this ideology makes him so terrifying to me, because Akainu gives a quote where he says, if we're going to do it, we do it thoroughly. If any of the scholars had managed to sneak on board, all sacrifices would have been a complete waste. Evil must be rooted out. And look, I kind of understand the premise behind what he's saying. Like, yeah, if a scholar escapes, then there's really no point in all of this. But at the same time, you don't just have to unprompted destroy a civilian ship. And really, it's that last line that's so haunting, because it perfectly gives you a window into his way of thinking, which will be terrifying when some of our characters come across him, because he says evil must be rooted out. And it shows you this worldview he has of absolute justice. Because as far as I knew, he had no indication that there was a scholar on board. He wasn't ordered to do this. But no, in his mind, he was like, even the possibility that there is one scholar on board. And again, he has no intel that there's one scholar on board. He could always search the ship. But no, he's like, I'm willing to kill an entire civilian ship on the mere possibility, even though I don't have any intel or anything to base it on. And that's the real scary part, is if he's willing to do all this on a possibility, what is he willing to do in some other situations? Now, something else I wanted to mention is I first saw this in the anime, so I didn't see the line that they had in the manga that he would later be known as Admiral Akainu. But even with that being said, I could definitely tell like they were building up this character for something crazy. Now, I definitely didn't know just how crazy it was going to be, but even so, this moment left a lasting impression. And I think a very important thing when it comes to evaluating Akainu's worldview is when you contrast that with Aokiji's in this moment, his lazy justice. Because the thing about Aokiji is he's willing to consider like, okay, am I doing the right thing? How do I act in this situation? He doesn't just blindly follow orders, he doesn't just assume he's on the right side. And even in this moment, I wasn't sure what Aokiji was going to do for sure. It seemed like he was mostly fine with following orders, but then Akainu's actions freaked him out so much that in that moment he went from trying to stop Robin to actually helping her escape. And Aokiji actually gives an interesting quote to Robin before he sends her on her way, because Aokiji actually says, absolute justice sometimes drives a man insane. And that right there is a big part of the reason I'm highlighting this moment so much with why Akainu scares me, is because when I look at a character like Akainu, he actually seems to be a very realistic villain to me, which I know might sound kind of funny because he is a 10-foot tall magma man. But the reason I think it's realistic is Akainu actually starts with a pretty noble goal of upholding justice. Like, I'm sure we can all agree, in principle, fighting for justice is a good thing. The issue comes with how do you go about that? And also, one person's idea of justice is not another person's. Because when I look at a character like Akainu, I don't know his backstory. I would assume that as a child, he likely suffered a lot at the hands of different criminals, and to be fair, taking down bad pirates and things like that is a pretty noble goal. But the problem comes that when you're so certain you're doing the right thing that you don't even question the possibility you might be doing the wrong thing, that's when you go from a noble goal of upholding justice to becoming a villain. And this idea right here is what makes him so effective as a villain, but also so scary to me, is that when you look at our world and our history, the people who commit the worst atrocities are also the ones that are so certain that they're in the right. Because it's not the people who set out to do evil, who think that they're evil, who actually commit the worst atrocities. It's the people that are so certain that they're good, who don't even question the possibility that they could do evil. They are often the ones who are the most capable of evil because they don't even self-reflect. And so when I look at somebody like Akainu and his absolute justice, he is so absolutely certain that he is good and that he is fighting evil. So when he says things like evil must be rooted out, it doesn't simply mean the people who everyone can agree are doing evil, like some of the worst pirates. But no, if you 100% believe that you are doing the right thing, then even people on your side who may mildly oppose you, you know, the people who are like, okay, maybe you shouldn't go that far, then all of a sudden even those people become evil in your mind. Because if you're so certain that you're right, then even people who may push back a little bit, they must be wrong. And we get to see that with Akainu, and I'm going to discuss more of it at Marineford. And so in totality, I'm trying to highlight how this moment here, his introduction, although it was brief, it definitely left a lasting impact, and it showed you why absolute justice is so terrifying, and we get to see examples of it all throughout Marineford, and I'm going to dive into them now. Now, finally getting into Marineford and his actions there, and I'm also going to discuss some of the other stuff after Marineford and his lasting impact on the series so far. But even so, I understand I spent a lot of time basically setting up just his ideology because that is horrifying. But even going into Marineford, I mentioned I didn't know that he was the final admiral. I mentioned how the manga, when he was introduced as Vice Admiral Sakazuki, had a line under it that basically said later to be known as Admiral Akainu. But the thing is, I was only watching the anime at that point, so I knew like, okay, I better remember this guy because that guy was insane. But at Marineford, you're finally introduced to all the admirals together, and they come out and they have that iconic triple chair shot. But at the same time, it definitely does feel intentional that he's in the middle. Again, I'm not trying to get into power scaling based on where they stay, but it is important on where people are positioned. Because again, Oda would know that when he places somebody in the middle, that person is going to draw the most attention. Not to mention, out of the three admirals, Akainu was definitely the most mysterious at this point. The only thing we had seen of him up to this point was that one moment in the Ohara flashback. Now granted, it was definitely an impactful moment, so Oda definitely built up just how scary this character was going to be. But even so, Oda had intentionally saved his power revelation for last. Because again, when this man revealed his powers, you realize like, okay, do not mess with him. Because I've talked about some of the reasons why Akainu terrifies me as a villain, but I haven't even mentioned the fact that this man is immensely powerful. And the thing is, if I had to pick the perfect devil fruit for him, only knowing his personality, I'm not sure if I could have chosen one more tailor-made for him than the one he got. Because again, this man has some absurdly destructive magma powers. And really, this only adds to why he's so terrifying. Because just like how a volcanic eruption is a horrifying natural disaster, Akainu is also the personification of a natural disaster in the One Piece world. And you get to see all throughout Marineford as he's using his power just how destructive it is. Because he definitely puts on a light show. Not to mention all the other crazy stuff he does with his powers. He even destroys Whitebeard's ship. And again, we know from One Piece how important and symbolic a ship is. And this is not just a random ship. No, this is the symbol of the Whitebeard pirates. We saw how devastating the death of the Going Merry was. Akainu using these absurdly destructive powers to destroy Whitebeard's ship sends a massive message. But anyway, I simply wanted to highlight just how strong he was because that's another reason why he's terrifying. And even when I was first coming into Marineford, I do think it's fascinating that the other two admirals our crew had encountered, both Aokiji and Kizaru, nearly wiped out the crew, and they weren't even trying that hard. So you know somebody like Akainu, who unlike the other two admirals, seems to have a much greater hatred for pirates and really anything he considers to be evil. So if the other two admirals nearly caused massive devastation without even really trying that hard, imagine how terrifying an admiral can be when they're really trying. Because again, this man Akainu has a genuine hatred for pirates. It only makes me more and more interested to actually see a little bit of his backstory. I'm not sure if I'll ever get it, but I am certainly kind of curious. But circling back around to the major reason this man is terrifying to me as a villain, it really comes back to his ideology of absolute justice, which we see on full display all throughout Marineford. And one of the most shocking displays of his absolute justice is when he encounters a Marine trying to flee the battlefield. Now, of course, I'm not oblivious to the fact that you can't just desert, especially in war, so I definitely understand that there should have been some punishment for this soldier. But even as somebody who doesn't know the One Piece laws, judging from the way that Kobe and Helmeppo reacted to this, I'm assuming it's not right what Akainu did. Because again, this soldier is not the enemy, but when Akainu sees his weakness, as he calls it, when he sees him trying to flee the battlefield, because of this man's absolute justice, he then sees him as the enemy. Because in Akainu's mind, it's not simply the bad pirates who are the evildoers, but it's also the people who he deems as weak because they don't try to stop those evildoers. Like you see in that moment the amount of disgust Akainu has for this guy, like he is truly the enemy to him. And he just straight up executes him, no trial or anything. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say he probably should not have done that. Like I imagine if Sengoku heard about that, he probably would be like, what? Like Akainu, you can't just be going around killing Marines, even if they're deserting. And the thing is, that's not even the craziest example of what he tries to do to a Marine in this arc. Because we also see the insanity that is absolute justice manifest when Kobe tries to get in this man's way. Because of course, towards the end of the war, Kobe sees the amount of insanity and chaos going on, and he's just like, okay, we won. We need to stop so we can help out the wounded soldiers because of course our own men are dying. But then you see a window into just how terrifying Akainu is, because then in his mind, and he even tells Kobe this, he's like, because you wasted a few of my precious seconds, you are the enemy and you need to be put down. Like in broad daylight in front of everyone, simply because Kobe was like, hey, can we stop? This man was about to kill a Marine in front of everyone. Keep in mind, these are people who are technically on his side, but this gets back to this idea of why absolute justice is so terrifying to me. Because absolute justice believes evil must be entirely rooted out, but then it opens up the question of what is evil and who are the evildoers in his mind. Because again, it's not simply the most obvious evildoers that everyone can agree on, but it's also anyone he decides is evil, which might be someone who just slightly opposes him. Also, if you've made it to this point in the video, it would mean a lot to me if you hit that subscribe button. And something else I wanted to mention, and I do think it's fundamentally important when evaluating the threat level of someone, is not simply what are they able to do as an individual, but rather it's also how are they able to influence others around them. Like even in Marineford, Mihawk pointed this out about Luffy, because Mihawk noticed that with Luffy, his real power and the real special thing about him is the way he's able to inspire so many people to join his side. And I would argue Marineford shows us Akainu is able to do something similar. Now, of course, it definitely manifests in other ways, but we see this influence on other Marines. And something about Marineford that is routinely stressed is that it's the changing of the eras. And the thing is, it's not only the pirates that this is important for, but equally and maybe even more importantly, it was also the changing of the eras for the Marines. Because on the pirate side, we see the new generation emerge of Luffy and Buggy and Blackbeard and even Shanks and some others. But on the Marine side, we also see something similar, because we see prominent people who are going to influence the Marines going forward emerge. We of course see people like Kobe, for example. We also see Akainu, obviously. He takes almost like a stranglehold of the Marines. And so one of the scary things about Akainu is that as the battle was going on, you got to see the influence of certain Marines like Sengoku and even Garp. Their influence was being diminished, as the influence of Akainu and his absolute justice was only increasing. And you got to see the Marines were only getting more and more bloodthirsty. Akainu's bloodthirst and his absolute justice kind of took hold of the battlefield. So yes, I mentioned that to say that just like how Luffy is able to influence others, we also see that Akainu is negatively able to influence Marines to his side, which is another reason why he's such a terrifying character to me. And this only becomes more relevant and makes him potentially far more terrifying when you take into account that this man is the new fleet admiral. So One Piece gave you a sampling of the negative aspects aspects of his ideals and how they could spread to the Marines. And that only makes me wonder just what he could do in a future conflict, which I believe Oda is setting up for. But in addition to everything I've mentioned about why he's scary, one of the other major reasons he truly stands out as a little different from some of the other One Piece villains is simply this man's insane determination. Like, say what you will about Akainu, even if you hate this guy, and a lot of people hate this guy, one thing you can't deny is his insane determination. Like, maybe this is a controversial viewpoint, but I genuinely believe that when you also factor in a character's willingness to do what they have to, that there may not be a character I've seen in One Piece with greater determination than Akainu. Now keep in mind, I'm also including the fact that he's willing to do anything it takes. Like, a character like Luffy is not willing to do certain stuff. Akainu though, I am horrified thinking of the stuff this man would be willing to do to achieve his goals. Because even at Marineford, one of the interesting things about Akainu is the fact that he's willing to do all sorts of different things to achieve his goals. Like, he doesn't only rely on brute strength, for example, but he's also willing to try some grimy tactics, like he's able to trick Squard into betraying Whitebeard. Now granted, that seemed to be Sengoku's plan, but Akainu was more than willing to get on board with it. This is not a guy who's above using any tactics at his disposal. Because in his mind, if he judges that you're evil, he's willing to do anything and everything it takes. We even see that after Ace gets free and he's running, that Akainu doesn't immediately run after him, but no, he baits Ace into turning around by taunting the Whitebeard pirates. Now maybe you could say he was lucky that Ace took the bait, and you would be right. But at the same time, I'm simply trying to highlight that this man is willing to do anything and everything it takes to achieve his goals. And even circling back around to his determination, after Ace got free and it seemed like the Whitebeard side had mostly won, Akainu basically took command of the battlefield. And he was the one who told the Marines, like, don't worry, none of them are getting away. Like, in his mind, he was completely confident none of the pirates were going to escape. And of course, we got to see how relentless he was, and that's kind of the scary thing about him. Because when I was first watching it and Ace got free, I was just like, okay, you know, it was to be expected. But Akainu had different ideas, and he was just like, no, this is not the part where you guys win. Because again, in One Piece and different anime, we see time and time again, when things look pretty hopeless, the heroes and the main characters, they somehow find a way of winning. But this time would be different, and Oda was trying to tell you through Akainu, like, okay, this guy is a little different. He doesn't stop, he doesn't accept defeat, he is relentless. Just like a volcanic eruption, he is a natural disaster to our main characters. And once he has a goal in mind, almost nothing is going to stop him, because even after he does what he does to Ace, we see the absurd clash he has with Whitebeard. And to give him a little bit of credit, he did the vast majority of the damage to Whitebeard. Like, when you look at Whitebeard, most of the damage was by Akainu. But even so, Whitebeard gave this man such an insane beating. He hit him with his most powerful attack. This man sunk into the earth, and somehow he even came back, and he was more relentless. But speaking of his relentlessness, the final major point I'm going to discuss has to do with the relationship he has in the story to Luffy. Because of course, when judging a villain, you have to judge them based on what they do or their impact on the main character. And this final point might be the strongest reason why he's arguably the most terrifying villain I've seen in One Piece. And really, it's the fact that no other villain has taken as much from Luffy as Akainu did. Now, of course, you could say like Kizaru was the reason why Luffy's crew was scattered all around the world, but at the same time, all of them still had their lives, they were able to regroup, and Kizaru is not nearly as villainous as Akainu is. But yes, Akainu has a special place even in the psyche of Luffy. And we even get to see that in Fishman Island when Akainu's name is brought up to Luffy, you see him grimace. Because again, that memory of what Akainu did and what Akainu took from him will always be there with Luffy. And it's not exactly something he can forget, because anytime he sees his chest, he remembers the scar that Akainu gave him. And we see this idea that scars in the One Piece world are very important. Whether it's Shanks talking about the scars Blackbeard gave him, or it's the scar Luffy has, which is a constant reminder of just what Akainu did to him. Plus, when you really think about it, Akainu basically won, because when it comes to Marineford, the goal was to execute Ace, and he was the one that accomplished that. Now, of course, Akainu wasn't happy with the fact that Luffy got away, but even so, one of the other things I even wanted to mention with his relationship with Luffy is that Akainu at some point during Marineford realized, more so than basically every other character, the threat level of Luffy. Like, I made a video talking about this, but it's interesting that in many ways, Akainu was a bigger believer in Luffy's potential than most of the other characters in the story. Because during the events of Marineford, Luffy was arguably the character that Akainu despised the most. And I think he also saw the greatest potential in Luffy, which I also believe is setting up a massive future clash between Akainu and Luffy, because at some point during Marineford, Akainu looked at the main character and was like, I need to make sure I stop him more than anyone else. Even when we think about Ace dying, Akainu was going after Luffy. Now maybe you could say it was to taunt him or this or that. I would like to think, and again, I don't have any proof of this, but I would like to think that when he saw Ace and Luffy before him, that he decided in that moment that Luffy is the bigger threat if I let him leave. And then once I take care of him, then I can kill Ace. Now again, maybe you disagree with me, but I also think one of the reasons why Akainu is a bit of a different villain is the fact that whatever he saw in Luffy terrified him, and he decided like, okay, no matter what, I can't let him leave. And this man was willing to go through basically anyone to stop Luffy. Like even when all the whitebeard commanders got in his way and some of the revolutionaries and also Crocodile, he was like, I will go through each and every single one of you because I am not letting Luffy live. Now again, it basically took a miracle with Shanks arriving to stop Akainu, because this man was relentless. He was not going to stop. It didn't matter who you were, if you were a revolutionary, a pirate, a marine like Kobe, he was willing to go through everyone if it meant getting to Luffy. And so this is a big part of the reason why he's so scary to me as a villain, is even because of the unique hatred he has for Luffy, but also the scarring he did to Luffy both physically but also on his psyche. And you can make an argument that Akainu is the single biggest reason why the Straw Hats took the 2-year training arc, because again, after Marineford, you saw he broke Luffy. Now thankfully Luffy had Jinbei and others to help him, but Luffy had never been more psychologically broken in this story than after what Akainu did to him, which is why Akainu in my mind has a special place even among villains. So yes, I know I've rambled a lot, but there are so many reasons why this man Akainu is special even among villains, because unlike so many villains who inevitably lose, this man was like a natural disaster. He was like a volcanic eruption itself, simply there to cause devastation. And more than the other villains in the story, he's one that can actually claim, I actually beat Luffy, I stopped him from getting what he wanted. So I genuinely believe that Luffy suffering a crushing defeat to Akainu, and the fact that Luffy was able to use this as motivation to get stronger, I believe this sets up a massive future encounter between Luffy and Akainu. And again, I definitely look forward to it. Now I imagine Akainu is more of an endgame villain, much like Blackbeard. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts. What do you think about this? Please share your thoughts, and thank you for watching.